question for the Harvard X team. You had mentioned, I think, how many countries were your participants from?
144.
I'm curious how that affected or impacted your discussion forums.
Great question. Yeah.
So it was interesting in a couple of respects. I'll use our Civil War module as an example because I think it is a good one. One of the questions we thought a lot about before launching that module was, well, especially if you're a student from a country that is not the United States, how much background do we need to provide to ensure that we're having a really productive conversation about the poetry of the Civil War, and how much support do we need to provide, how many resources. And so we talked about this a lot, and the course itself actually did not focus, did not provide a tremendous amount of historical background, although we provided a number of links to other resources. We recommended Eric Foner's a Civil War course on the site. But I think, we tried to be really aware as discussion moderators too, to frame our questions or frame our responses, sometimes padding in a little bit more context where it seemed that context was necessary. So we were particularly aware with that for the Civil War module, but I do think it applies to most of our modules, all of which were historically oriented.
Yeah, and I mean, to give like a brief sense of a little bit how those broke down, so the 144 countries, but the U.S., that was about like 45% of participants were coming from the U.S., and then I think India was like 5%, China was like 4%, and then the rest there. So like there was an overwhelming majority from the U.S., but it also impacted the sort of cultural assumptions too that came with it. But a funny thing was too that like sometimes it's beautiful, sometimes you just can't tell where people are coming from at all. So there was a way in which it like heightened underlying cultural assumptions we didn't think about, but it also was able to flatten some of them as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Yes, thank you all again for your presentations. My name is Alan Cattier. I'm from the Information Technology Division here at Dartmouth. And I'm also, I guess in terms of my own academic background, schooled in the humanities, and happily so. And what I find in living in these two lives, in my technological life, one of the things that has come to be kind of spoken about generally is that in looking at MOOCs in particular, in looking at where they are in a technological timeline, there's an organization called Gartner which ranks and rates technologies, and they talk about MOOCs in particular being in a trough of disillusionment. That's kind of the popular response of technologists. And in thinking about the relative lack of humanities courses that have been represented within that history up to this present moment, I'd be interested in the four of yours thoughts on what you think particularly the humanities has to offer the form of the MOOC, and in particular what you think has been missing in the evolution of the MOOC that you've either seen in the courses that you have delivered or that you're looking to deliver. Thank you.
Who'd like to take that first? Don't all jump at once. I can give you an example. Maybe that will start your creative juices flowing. Something that occurred to me as I'm watching these screenshots and things that you've shared from your different MOOCs is that I see more in what you and Jennifer too were sharing, more video that is displaying conversation than I do in some of the science and technology MOOCs that I've been in. And so I think that emphasis on conversation that Adrienne and Emily were talking about, and others as well, and the way that conversation builds community might be something that has a long way to go still. that might be something humanities brings to the table. But maybe there's some better examples, since I am not a humanist, that you could share with me.
Well, I'll jump on top of that point because I think it's a really good one. One of the things that our course has focused on is, well, for instance, if we're reading Dickinson's I Cannot Dance Upon My Toes, right, what do actual dancers have to say about that poem, have to think about that poem? And so Lisa brought in two dancers who read the poem with her and kind of actually talked about, at what point in history did people actually go up on their toes in dance, right? And so they brought a very different perspective, and then Lisa would lean in and say, well, as a scholar of poetry, I see that this poem is broken up into such and such number of lines, and this is what the rhyme scheme looks like. So I think one of the things about the conversation piece that is so kind of interesting and enlivening for me is, as Adrienne kind of talked about briefly, kind of the interdisciplinarity, right? So how do we bring all of these people who are doing really interesting things in different areas of the humanities, people who are academics, people who are not academics, people who are poets, and people who are readers of poetry together in a way that feels pretty robust. There are a lot of voices, and I think that kind of conversation, the emphasis on conversation, as you say, is really key. But that would just be kind of one reflection.
So the thought that comes into my mind, Alan, and I apologize to you all that I wasn't at the first panel, the joy of being the chair of a department, is conversation from a different aspect. And one of the challenges I am witnessing as our MOOC on opera is still in its first week. And that is, it's not as though folks in science, technology, engineering aren't disputational. I do discover that there are many folks, when you open up the opera box, at the bottom is hope, but it is Pandora's box. And so where one of the things we were wrestling with was, is this truly an introduction? And if so, we really do want it on the bottom shelf, but we've already had, one interesting thread asking, what is Italian opera? And so we get this whole disputation that, to me was turtles all the way down. It means that only Italians get to talk about Italian opera if we take it to its logical extreme. So how to manage that riotous community that seems to come to the fore much more quickly in the arts and the humanities than perhaps it does in the sciences, maybe even the social sciences. I think that's one of the challenges that we face, because we're not, as Jed was saying, we're not in the business of saying this is what you need to know and only this, but we're opening different opportunities for exploration, and while we don't want to necessarily squelch certain kinds of paths down through a MOOC, there are those who you were talking about certain louder voices who could probably capitalize and take over a thread and maybe take things in a direction that are interesting, maybe elucidate certain things, but at the same time may be counterproductive to the vision that certain folks have about what might happen. Now, maybe Jed is less troubled by that kind of, hijacking of just the, you have 20 ideas and all of a sudden somebody dumps 40 more and it's like, hey, that's great. I want to get through Italian opera at least. And so.
Yes.
What? Yes, what?
Yes, bring it on.
Bring the microphone to me.
I think one big danger about including video of conversation is telling people that this is what it means to talk about the stuff that we talk about. I worry about that constantly. There are political dimensions to this. When we have a group of Harvard or Dartmouth students or Colgate students up on a platform telling learners around the world, this is what it means to talk about literature or music. I think that's a problem. I think there are ways that we can counter that. We are sidestepping it in our course, in our initial run, by having former Dartmouth students be the audience. So they can talk amongst themselves, and that's fine. But that's a very significant concern. I think a lot of what we do in the humanities is actually saying no. When someone announces the answer that they got it, right? That, they're like, oh, I know what this means. Like, no. It's like an infinite amount of sort of refusals of that fixing of meaning. That's what I'm interested in. That's the main point of what I was trying to get at with the reduction of our teaching to dispensing information. We're saying no a lot. So therefore, bring on more voices.
First of all, it's a terrific panel. All of the papers are excellent. I want to raise a question that's linked to the conversation you're having amongst yourselves, and it's around what you do with interdisciplinary conversation. Do you assume that the presuppositions that inform, say, Lisa New's understanding of the stakes of a Whitman poem would be more or less the same as that which informs Ellen Kagan's, who's reading from the standpoint perhaps of legal reasoning? If there are folks from, say, India who have an understanding of the ways in which rhythms operate in a Whitman line that obey the much more complex harmonics of the Vedas, for example, which Whitman read, would you say in the conversation that's designed to establish a context that reader informed by presupposing the Vedas as the context for reading Whitman would have to suspend those presuppositions in order to engage what I understand from your description to be a context-driven pedagogical conversation that's drawing together a series of divergent strands in order to resolve them? Isn't the function of teaching together from different disciplines the recognition of the different presuppositions you internalize? And should that be a metacognitive dimension of the conversation? If you just have conversations across disciplines and say, oh, we're expanding because does that lose the stakes of the interdisciplinarity of the conversation? Should those stakes enter into the MOOC instruction?
I think, Jed is talking a lot about having to say, no. I think my response would be to say, often our job with getting a lot of those assumptions is to say yes, but a qualified yes. Yes, and, or yes, but, yes, therefore, yes, however, So I think this also points to something that we've been struggling with not struggling with, but really pushing ourselves is how to both have enthusiasm and rigor at the same time, how to get analysis into this thing that, it's wonderful to have a book club scenario online, but how do you, you want that sort of fervor, but you want that fervor with this rigor and stakes, and if there aren't necessarily correct answers, there are answers that are deeper, and there are ways of talking about it that are more rigorous in certain senses. So I think that's actually also where we've seen a lot of opportunities come out with the form that somebody's saying, I'm from India, I have all of these sources, here's how I'm thinking about it. Then we'll be able to say, oh, great, I hadn't ever kind of experienced that before, and then we get to go look it up and see what's happening, and then be able to say, okay, so now if we're thinking about it in this kind of frame, so, and all this is very similar to what goes on in a brick and mortar classroom too, but I think it's true that what you're pointing to is something that I think it's a situation where the MOOC environment can both kind of heighten the possibilities, but also heighten some of the pitfalls.
Yeah.
And I would just add, I think the conversations that we're videotaping, there's never a sense that, right, this is the way, right, that you have to be someone very familiar with poetry and law in order to arrive at the right interpretation, right? I think one of the things that, one of the underlying assumptions, which I hope is explicit in the course, is that this is one kind of conversation about poetry, right? These are two people who are enjoying a conversation about Whitman or Dickinson, who are noticing things about the poem, perhaps informed by the perspectives, the experiences that they bring to the poem, and that in fact, that is a model for the students who then come in and bring their individual perspectives to the poem. And I think as course moderators, we're always thinking about, okay, well, how do we make sure that that we're thinking about meter? How do we make sure we're thinking about rhythm? How do we make sure we're thinking about kind of all of the formal elements? And at the same time, kind of fostering the really wonderful reflections that are coming out of the diversity of experiences that I think are in fact what make the MOOC such an exciting space.
I have a question for Emily and Adrienne. I'm wondering, I think this is a pretty deceptively simple question. How did you pick the custom tool? How did you pick or choose that you're going to make a custom tool for annotation? And there's a lot that's bound up in that. There's genius out there. As we saw earlier today, you could have used that. But there's politics around that. It's a for-profit company. It's not Wikipedia. It's also you're linking out. You're sending students away from the course, so you lose students. We have data that says you lose students. There's a great expense to that. But how do you balance all of these things? How do you decide we're going to make something custom for our course? Versus we're going to use an open educational resource that may not be perfect for us, but might be good enough. I mean, where do you figure that out?
Great question.
And we should start by saying, so the decision predated both of our entrance into the course, but I think we can still talk about it. So one of the things that I think was really attractive about having a customized tool was the fact, and you alluded to this, that it could be embedded right in the course. So essentially you're clicking through the courseware, you watch the video, and then you scroll right under the video, and there is the tool, and then you scroll down a little bit more, and there is the discussion question, and you click the link and you go right into the discussion forum. So it is a seamless process, and I think it has actually become, starting, and it was really difficult starting out. The early versions of the tool, which we have seen, had a lot of functionality issues, but it has now developed into something that Harvard can plug and chug into various Canvas courses that are using the Canvas platform. So I think part of it is really ease of access, ease of use.
Yeah, I was just going to say too, because the decision predated us, I'm not sure politically speaking kind of what went into it, but I think pedagogically speaking, it's become really important. Like, even though the tool has been really buggy at times, it also was such a vital kind of philosophical part of the course that I think it was really pedagogically important to the people designing it, that it would be something that we'd be able to kind of control from all back, front, sideways ends of it, and that we wouldn't be if we had an idea of something that we wanted to do with it, we wouldn't have to wait for somebody else to kind of update the software on it.
That's the classic build it or buy it problem, right? And it's always on the horizon, I think, for every innovative thing we try to do, including our folks at the platforms, right? So we try to work with them too. And all this pedagogical conversation that we've had, I think, is going to inform that as we continue to move forward. So let me encourage you to do a few things. Please stay in touch with Jed, with all of us. Don't be surprised when you hear from one of us, because we're going to have lots of questions moving forward. And we hope to continue to bring these conversations to the forefront at a high level, and here at Dartmouth, and over coffee, and over wine, which is happening next in the Arts and Humanities Resource Center. So I'd like to thank our panelists once again. With a round of applause, please. Thank you all.